No one saw it coming, not the embassy staff, not Washington. At dawn in Ouagadougou, the U.S. embassy doors slammed shut, loud, final, deliberate. No alarms, no warning, just silence. Inside, a sealed letter arrived, short, chilling. Captain Ibrahim Traore had ordered the immediate expulsion of 800 Americans. Not one press briefing, not one apology, just action. Every name handpicked, every exit sealed. A silent operation had begun. This wasn't diplomacy. This was a line drawn in the sand, and the world didn't know how to respond. If you care about sovereignty, truth, and raw power, like this video and subscribe. What happens next will stun you. If you believe that a small nation can still stand tall against global powers, if you believe that Africa has the right to write its own story in its own voice, if you've seen that fire in Captain Ibrahim Traore's eyes and felt what it means, then this story belongs to you too. Like this video. Subscribe to this channel. Not just to show support, but to walk alongside a rising tide. A tide of truth, a tide of dignity. Because what started as whispers in Ouagadougou is fast becoming a silent storm, and storms, when they rise, cannot be ignored. And then came the letter, slipped under a locked door, no ceremony, no warning, just thick paper marked priority, presidential dispatch. Inside one sentence, calm but devastating. The transitional government hereby declares the immediate expulsion of 800 American nationals from the territory of Burkina Faso. Signed by Captain Ibrahim Traore himself. That name, written in black ink, landed like a hammer blow. People froze. A junior officer dropped his mug. Another whispered, "This can't be real." But it was. The seal was authentic. The wording left no room for negotiation. It wasn't a request, it was an order. And it wasn't coming from a spokesperson or a committee. It came straight from the man in charge. Captain Ibrahim Traore had spoken, and the shock was immediate. Embassy staff scrambled, phone lines lit up, internal memos flew across secured networks. But there was no time. The letter wasn't just a message, it was a countdown. Something bigger had already been set in motion. This wasn't a diplomatic disagreement. It was a calculated strike delivered in silence with the precision of a soldier. And behind that one sentence was the weight of a nation finally standing on its own feet. But the real shock wasn't in the letter, it was in the list. Attached to the order was a sealed document stamped with a red insignia and the words, "Clean soil, eyes only." Inside 800 names, not vague titles, not generic roles, full names, locations, roles, exit routes already identified. This wasn't a mass expulsion, it was a targeted silent operation. Contractors near gold mines, intelligence officers posing as aid workers, civilian consultants embedded in military-adjacent zones, every one of them marked for departure. It wasn't personal, it was strategic. Every name meant something. Every inclusion had a reason, and that's what made it terrifying. This wasn't chaos, it was choreography. Months of surveillance, weeks of planning, executed with absolute control. There were no leaks, no diplomatic murmurs beforehand. Just a clean sweep planned down to the minute. Captain Ibrahim Traore had done what many assumed impossible. He had outmaneuvered a global power on his own soil without firing a shot. And he'd done it quietly. The operation's name wasn't symbolic. Clean soil was a declaration Burkina Faso would no longer be foreign-owned, even in the shadows. That silence. It wasn't fear, it was resolve. Back inside the embassy, panic was no longer a possibility, it was the atmosphere. Senior diplomats slammed doors behind them. Staff whispered in corridors. Nobody knew who to trust. The list was real. The order was official. And Washington had been caught off guard. There was no pre-warning, no classified briefing. Just this brutal, unflinching reality. 800 Americans were being forced to leave a sovereign nation by decree of Captain Ibrahim Traore. Phone lines to the Pentagon lit up. Analysts scrambled for context. Some believed it had to be a bluff. Others feared something worse, a precedent. Not even during the height of the Cold War had such a move been made this swiftly, this cleanly by a nation so small, yet so resolute. One senior intelligence officer reportedly asked, "How did we miss this?" Another replied, "We weren't looking in the right direction." But Captain Ibrahim Traore had been preparing for this moment all along. He didn't need to speak. His silence did the work. And in that silence, a new kind of leadership was emerging, calm, calculated, and unwilling to bend. The embassy had power, but for the first time in decades it had no control, and that terrified everyone inside. But this wasn't just a message to America. It was a signal to the entire continent. Captain Ibrahim Traore wasn't trying to win a media battle, he was drawing a line for every African watching. A line between compromise and dignity, between dependence and control, and that line was drawn in Ouagadougou. In corridors of power from Nairobi to Dakar, whispers turned into questions. Could we do the same? Because what Captain Traore had done wasn't only bold, it was contagious. He didn't just challenge one embassy, he challenged an entire system that for decades operated quietly behind closed doors, pulling strings most citizens would never see. His silence wasn't weakness, it was resistance. It was the refusal to explain something that needed no explanation. Burkina Faso belongs to its people, not to foreign interests masked as friendly partners, and that idea spoken without a microphone struck deeper than any speech ever could. Other leaders felt it, so did the streets, because in every village, in every capital, young Africans had just watched a man their age stand up, not with violence, not with slogans, but with precision, restraint, and absolute clarity. Captain Ibrahim Traore wasn't just acting for Burkina Faso, he was setting an example. And still, Captain Ibrahim Traore said nothing. No televised speech, no public statement, no dramatic press conference at the gates of the U.S. Embassy. Just silence. Heavy, deliberate silence, and in that silence, power. What happened in Ouagadougou wasn't just a diplomatic rupture, it was a global reckoning. Not because a superpower had been directly confronted, but because someone had done it without begging for attention. That's what shook the system. It's what made this different. Traore didn't posture, he didn't shout. He acted with discipline, clarity, and intent. His letter, his operation, his quiet confidence, they all spoke louder than any speech ever could. Journalists rushed for statements. None came. American analysts waited for back channels to open. They didn't. Instead, commercial flights were quietly booked. Security teams were doubled. Departure schedules were drawn up under embassy lights that never switched off. They were leaving, and the reason why, no one could publicly admit, because this wasn't just political, it was moral. Burkina Faso had made a choice not against America, but for itself. And slowly across Africa, people began to realize something: the rules had changed. In Ghana, a university student posted the words, "Ouagadougou is speaking for us all." It went viral in hours. In Senegal, protesters began to reference clean soil in their chants, demanding the review of all foreign military contracts. In Nigeria, opposition leaders asked whether their country's sovereignty had quietly been leased behind closed doors. And in the streets of Ouagadougou, no one rioted, no one panicked. There was pride, quiet, steady, fierce. Children walked past the embassy gates, pointing and asking questions. Fathers told them, that's what it looks like when a country stands tall. This wasn't about isolation. It wasn't about hatred. It was about boundaries, about respect, about the right of a people to say enough and to be heard without being punished. And it all started with one man in a modest uniform writing one page with one sentence. A sentence that reminded the world what leadership really means, the courage to choose what is right over what is easy. Captain Ibrahim Traore never raised his voice. He didn't need to. The echo of his action was louder than any headline, more enduring than any diplomatic threat. And in that moment, something shifted, not just in Burkina Faso, but in the hearts of millions who had been told their voices were too small, their nations too weak, their leaders too afraid. That silence, it wasn't emptiness, it was a message. And the world is still listening. There are moments in history that do not announce themselves with fanfare or fireworks. No breaking news banner, no applause, just stillness, the kind that follows something irreversible. What happened in Ouagadougou was one of those moments. There was no gunfire, no tanks in the streets, no angry mobs waving flags, only a letter, a list, a plan, and a leader who understood that true strength is quiet and terrifying when used without warning. Captain Ibrahim Traore did not act to impress. He did not act to provoke. He acted because the time had come to stop asking for permission to exist, and in doing so, he spoke on behalf of far more than just Burkina Faso. He gave voice to every nation told to stay in its lane, to every leader taught to smile while being undermined, to every people promised help but handed dependency. His silence broke the noise. For decades, Africa has been spoken for, written about, studied, lectured, managed. Policies were drafted in cities that had never touched African soil. Decisions made by people who never heard an African heartbeat. But now, for the first time in a long time, an African voice chose not to speak, but to act. That was the difference. The world didn't know how to respond because it had never seen this version of Africa. Not pleading, not explaining, not reacting, just choosing. Choosing to protect its soil. Choosing to stand without asking who might be offended. Choosing not to wait. And in that choice, Traore reminded the world of something it had conveniently forgotten. Burkina Faso is not a footnote. It is a nation, sovereign, proud, awake. Across the continent, his decision has begun to stir uncomfortable questions. Questions that can no longer be ignored. Who controls our airspace? Who funds our armies? Who owns the contracts beneath our feet? And most importantly, who benefits from our silence? Captain Ibrahim Traore didn't answer those questions with words. He answered them with action. And in doing so, he shifted the balance, not with war, but with will. It will take time for the dust to settle. Agreements will be challenged. Old powers will push back. But something has already changed. It's in the posture of a young man in Mali, holding a homemade sign that says, "We are not your projects." It's in the steady eyes of a Burkina soldier who now stands taller at his post. And it's in the quiet pride of a mother who tells her child today, "Our president made history." History is not always written in ink. Sometimes it's written in the silence that follows a slammed door. Captain Ibrahim Traore has reminded us, power does not need permission. Dignity does not need approval. And when Africa decides to stand not just tall, but free, the world will not be ready. But Africa will be. If you believe that a small nation can still rise, unshaken before the weight of global powers, if you believe that Africa deserves to write its own story in its own language with its own hands, if you've seen the fire in Captain Ibrahim Traore's eyes and felt what it means, then this story is your story too. Like this video, subscribe to this channel, not for views, not for numbers, but to walk beside a rising wave of truth, a wave that started as whispers and is now a storm rolling across the continent. This is no longer just about politics. It has become a reckoning, a bold declaration, and a new rhythm pulsing from the very heart of Africa. We are no longer waiting in the shadows, no longer asking for space in someone else's vision. We are rising together with purpose and clarity. Let the world take notice. Let the silence that carried this message speak louder than any speech. Let it echo across borders, beyond headlines, because Africa is no longer whispering. It is awakening. Let history remember this time. Africa spoke for itself, and the world had to listen. The story of Captain Ibrahim Traore's decision to expel 800 American nationals from Burkina Faso is not simply a political headline. It is a profound lesson in leadership, sovereignty, and courage. In an age dominated by noise, where press conferences, social media, and diplomatic posturing often drown out meaningful action, Traore chose silence. And through that silence, he spoke volumes. His decision has become more than a national event. It is a symbol, a mirror, and a warning. It invites the world, and especially Africa, to rethink the nature of power, the meaning of independence, and the price of dignity. The first lesson we draw is that true leadership is not defined by size, but by conviction. Burkina Faso is a small nation by conventional standards. It does not command global markets or military alliances, but when its transitional president, Captain Traore, delivered a single-page letter declaring the expulsion of hundreds of American personnel, not through a press tour, but through direct action, the world paused. Leadership in this context was not about rhetoric, it was about resolve. Traore proved that when a leader is anchored by principle, not fear, even a small nation can shift global attention. Secondly, the operation codenamed Clean Soil offers a crucial lesson in strategic sovereignty. Sovereignty is often spoken of as a legal term, a constitutional principle. But in practice it is hollow, if not defended. Burkina Faso's move was not reactive. It was premeditated, precise, and surgical. Every name on the list had been identified. Every detail had been planned. This wasn't an angry outburst or nationalistic theater. It was an assertion of control, not just of territory, but of destiny. In doing so, Traore reminded us that sovereignty is not gifted. It must be claimed and protected even when the cost is high. There is also a deeper lesson in the use of silence as power. In international relations, we are used to loud diplomacy, press releases, speeches, leaks. The absence of comment is often read as weakness. But Captain Traore weaponized silence. He made it heavy. He made it final. And that created something rare: uncertainty in the minds of those who are used to controlling the narrative. By refusing to explain, Traore forced others to reflect. By withholding sound, he created space for meaning. The decision not to justify became paradoxically the strongest justification of all. This leads us to another essential insight. Africa is no longer waiting to be spoken for. For decades, African leaders have been told to partner, to comply, to align. They have been handed frameworks, agreements, and expectations shaped in Western capitals. The result has been visible policies that serve external interests, extractive contracts, and the slow erosion of public trust. But now, with one bold act, a different kind of leadership has emerged. Traore did not reject partnership. He rejected dependency. He did not seek isolation. He sought self-definition. His message to Africa was clear. Sovereignty is not just about flags and borders. It is about having the courage to choose your own path and to walk it alone if necessary. A fifth and perhaps more philosophical lesson is that dignity does not need to shout. In a world where image often overrides substance, Traore reminded us that quiet strength is still strength. He did not insult or provoke. He did not threaten or gloat. He simply acted. That kind of leadership inspires more than fear, it inspires reflection. And reflection, when done sincerely, can become revolution. This is why his decision resonated far beyond Ouagadougou. It wasn't just a blow to a superpower. It was a signal to every citizen who has ever felt powerless. It said, "You have more strength than they've taught you to believe." There are also lessons here for the international community. Particularly the West must reflect on the limits of informal influence and the dangers of underestimation. The quiet networks of military advisors, contractors, and development experts embedded in African states have often been used to manage geopolitical influence without open accountability. But when exposed, when questioned or rejected, those systems collapse under their own opacity. Traore's letter did not target a country, it targeted a method. And in doing so, he forced a conversation that can no longer be ignored. What role should foreign powers truly play in African affairs? And who gave them that role in the first place? The story also reaffirms that nation building is ultimately about trust. Traore did not make this move for applause. In fact, he made it knowing it would trigger panic, confusion, even diplomatic retaliation. But he did it because he believed his people would understand, and they did. There were no riots, no backlash. Instead, there was quiet support, street-level pride, a rare alignment between leadership and citizenry. That moment when the people of a country feel protected rather than exploited is the beginning of real nationhood. Furthermore, there is a generational lesson. Young Africans are watching, and what they see in Captain Ibrahim Traore is not just a man in uniform, but a reflection of what they might become. He is young. He is unpolished by traditional diplomacy. He is unafraid, and he speaks with action. In a continent where so many youth feel excluded from power, his rise is a radical signal the era of waiting is over. Leadership is not inherited. It is taken with clarity, sacrifice, and unshakable belief. Finally, the overarching lesson is, this history does not belong to the powerful. It belongs to the bold. In the years to come, analysts will debate whether this move was wise, whether it will last, whether it sets a good precedent. But none of that changes what it already is, a line in the sand, a statement of intent, a chapter begun not in a conference room, but in the quiet corridors of a West African capital. The day will come when students of diplomacy, sovereignty, and international law study this moment not because it fits the rules, but because it rewrote them. Captain Ibrahim Traore did not just expel 800 Americans. He reminded us that the world is shifting, not always loudly, not always dramatically, but often quietly, in places too often ignored. And in that quiet, a new Africa is speaking. The comments section under the video filled faster than anyone expected. Within minutes, thousands of viewers from across Africa and the diaspora began sharing their thoughts. What they wrote wasn't shallow praise or generic reactions. It was thoughtful, raw, and deeply personal. Many saw in Captain Ibrahim Traore a reflection of something long-buried dignity. One viewer from Ghana wrote, "This is the kind of leader we were told only existed in books. But now we're seeing him flesh and blood, and he's from our continent." Another viewer from Kenya reflected on the silence that surrounded the operation. He commented, "The most powerful thing about this entire act is that it was done without a single speech. No drama, just clarity. That kind of silence frightens those who rely on noise to dominate." His sentiment was echoed by others, who noted that Traore's calm made the gesture all the more serious. "When a man speaks softly and still shakes empires," one user added, he's not playing politics. He's leading. For many young Africans, the story was deeply emotional. A woman from Nigeria shared, "I cried watching this. Not because of anger or pride, but because I realized for the first time what it feels like to see someone defend us without apology. No compromise, no backdoor, just full, honest defiance." Her words received hundreds of likes and replies. A university student from Tanzania responded, "This isn't just about Burkina Faso anymore. It's about the whole continent waking up, one country at a time." Viewers from the diaspora also chimed in, particularly from the UK, France, and the United States. A user identifying as African Caribbean wrote, "Watching Traore makes me feel connected to the motherland in a way I've never felt before. He's not just standing up for Burkina Faso. He's standing up for every African who has ever been told to be silent, to be small." Another viewer based in London added, "We were raised to think Africa needed saving. But what I see here is Africa saving itself finally." Not all the comments were purely celebratory. Some viewers raised critical questions concerned about the possible retaliation Burkina Faso could face. "Let's not pretend this was without risk," wrote one viewer from South Africa. "The US doesn't take embarrassment lightly. I just hope Traore and his people are prepared for what comes next." This concern was met with thoughtful replies. One user responded, "Yes, but if we always lived in fear, we'd never move forward. There's a price for freedom. The question is, are we willing to pay it?" There were also messages of admiration for the strategy behind the operation. "The level of planning this required is extraordinary," a Cameroonian analyst commented. "Months of surveillance, no leaks, every name verified. That shows us one thing: this wasn't emotional, it was professional. We need more of this in African leadership. Someone else replied, it was military-grade precision with civilian-level discipline. That balance is rare. And Traore pulled it off. One of the most powerful reflections came from a former Burkinabe living in Paris. I left my country years ago because I felt it had no future, he wrote. Today, for the first time, I want to go back. Not because things are perfect, but because someone is finally fighting for us without fear, without shame. His comment was met with emotional responses. One woman simply wrote, "Come home. The doors are opening again." As the video circulated further, artists, poets, and thinkers began using the event as inspiration. A young spoken-word artist posted, "Captain Traore taught us how to write poetry in silence, how to say 1,000 things with one act. This isn't just political, it's spiritual." Others turned the act into symbols. One commenter wrote, "The pen that signed that letter was mightier than any drone." That's how revolutions begin in the 21st century. There was also a strong current of Pan-Africanism in the conversation. What Traore did is what Sankara would have done if he were alive today, a viewer wrote. This is continuity, not just in words, but in action. Others drew comparisons to leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, Patrice Lumumba, and Amilcar Cabral, arguing that Traore had entered that rare circle of African revolutionaries who confront power with principle. Even some non-African viewers expressed admiration, though their tone was more cautious. One viewer from Norway wrote, "I don't know enough about the context, but it's clear this man believes in something bigger than himself, and that's rare in any part of the world." A user from Brazil commented, "Watching from the global south, this gives us hope too, that we don't have to live forever under someone else's idea of what's best for us." Among the most shared comments was a simple but powerful line, "Africa has spoken," this time without permission. That sentence appeared in multiple languages, French, Portuguese, Arabic, Swahili, reposted and retranslated across platforms. It became a kind of digital chant, a reminder that the story had left the realm of politics and entered the realm of collective imagination. Several commenters pointed out the contrast between Traore and other African heads of state. While others sign away our resources in air-conditioned hotels, one viewer wrote, "Traore signs one letter and rewrites our future." Another added, "He didn't go to Davos. He didn't bow to Paris. He stayed in Ouagadougou," and drew the line there. That's leadership. By the end of the day, thousands of comments had poured in. Some were analytical, others poetic. Some filled with rage at past injustice, others filled with cautious optimism. But all of them had one thing in common: they treated this moment as real, as important, as historic. For many, it was the first time in their lives they had felt such unity across borders. As one young woman from Ethiopia wrote, "I don't care what happens next. This has already changed us. We've seen what it looks like to stand. We've seen that it's possible. Now, we can never unsee it." And perhaps in the end, that is the deepest truth of all. Once people witness dignity, they will never settle for anything less again.